At Starbound, we like to tell stories the human way, not with artificial slop or AI voices. What's HFY without humanity? So, subscribe if you want to keep it that way. My name is Dan, and let's begin. As Lihila watched the news about yet another frontline collapsing to the Brizak drones, she couldn't help but clutch her right arm and lean into the cushioned seat, her fingers tracing the scar near her wrist, a permanent mark from the day she saved the clueless human ambassador during his first appearance before the Galactic Council 5 years earlier. Those humans had reached the stars expecting a peaceful universe, only to have their illusions shattered by an acid-spilling Brizak on their very first day among other species. Since then, they had withdrawn to their homeworld, refusing all contact with the Council, after their ambassador had nearly been melted alive, an end he would certainly have met without her intervention. She honestly didn't blame the humans for closing the borders of their stellar system. Looking at the current state of her own planet right now, she almost envied them. The ability to simply turn away from the galaxy's chaos, to lock the door and pretend monsters outside didn't exist, that was a luxury her people no longer possessed. The Brizak had made sure of that when they'd begun their systematic campaign of conquest 2 years ago. Every day brought fresh reports of losses, the territory ceded, of defenses crumbling. And every day, Lihila felt the weight of those losses settle more heavily on her shoulders, even though she rationally knew, that she wasn't responsible. She opened her eyes again, not to check the virtual screen with the news that her optical implant made look real in her living room, but to look at her own arm. The regenerative treatments had done their work well over the years. She was seeing flawless pink skin, smooth and unblemished, with only the scar near her wrist proving that once she had been kind and made something reckless. The doctors offered to remove it completely multiple times, explaining how simple the procedure would be. But she refused each time. Some part of her needed that mark, that reminder of a time when her choices had mattered, when she had made a difference in the galaxy instead of just watching it all fall apart around her. She knew she was actively seeking comfort in the past rather than accepting the present. She was painfully aware that the memories of that day on the Galactic Council, where she had saved the human, were still much warmer when compared to the present. That warmth wasn't because of the human exactly, though the memory of his smile and sincere gratitude certainly played a small role in it. His name had been Darius, she remembered. Darius Reeves. He'd been so earnest, so hopeful, like a child stepping into a room full of adults and expecting everyone to be friendly. No, the warmth came from remembering who she had been that day. Back then, she had been very useful to her species, a competent ambassador who believed she had done a good job building bridges with other species, sealing trade deals, and even helping with a few military contracts here and there. She had walked through the corridors of the Galactic Council with her head held high, representing her people with pride and confidence. She laughed alone in frustration at the memories of what happened next. The Brizak declaration of war had come without warning, swift and brutal and completely unexpected by the intelligence services. One day, there had been tense negotiations over mining rights in disputed space. The next, their fleets had been crossing the border and reducing military installations to rubble. But worse than the declaration itself was what followed. The other species, whom she thought were her friends, abandoning her, refusing her calls when she asked for help. She had sent message after message, begging for aid, for intervention, for anything. But one by one, her so-called friends had made it clear that her people's survival wasn't worth risking their own security. And the worst of all, her own species blaming her and putting her competency in check, often criticizing her for saving that human. The criticism had started small, whispers in government corridors, anonymous comments on news articles. But it had grown. Politicians looking for someone to blame had found a convenient target. They had reached the absurd conclusion that saving Darius had perhaps angered the Brizak and caused the war. It was ridiculous, born of fear and desperation rather than logic. The Brizak's only goal for starting this war was weakening their military presence and destroying their economy and industry, making them compliant subjects for eventual annexation. Anyone who thought anything else was an utter fool, in her opinion. Lihila dismissed the floating window showing the news with a thought, the virtual display dissolving like smoke in wind. She stood in a huff to stare through the real window instead, pressing her palm against the cool glass and feeling the faint vibration of distant explosions transmitting through the building's structure. She was doing her best to forget about humans and war, forcing herself to worry about smaller things, manageable things, things she could theoretically control. Her silver hair had grown too long recently, falling past her shoulders in ways that would have been unthinkable during her diplomatic career. She should cut it. She should maintain her appearance, maintain some semblance of the professional woman she'd once been. And the weather. It was too rainy and killing her beautiful front garden. The flowers she had planted 3 seasons ago were drowning, the petals scattered across the flooded soil like tiny boats that had lost their way. She looked at the cloudy sky, pretending to not think about the noise of fight crafts flying above. It was a constant backdrop now. That high-pitched whine of engines and the occasional boom of something exploding in the upper atmosphere. Kind of thing one gets used to after 2 consecutive years of war. At least the Brizak, while caring very little about collateral damage, didn't target civilians directly and apparently were aiming for their future servitude as a conquered species rather than their extinction. She was already preparing herself mentally for the blaming gazes of her neighbors when she went outside to check for those plain grains the government was distributing as food, when suddenly her personal data slate began to vibrate over the table, the sharp buzzing cutting through her spiraling thoughts like a knife through fabric. She stared at it for a moment, confused and wary. The device was announcing an FTL call, the kind she didn't receive anymore after losing her role as ambassador when the war began. FTL communication was expensive, reserved for official business and emergencies. The bandwidth required to maintain a real-time conversation across light years cost more than most people earned in a month. Who would be calling her? And more importantly, who could afford to? She picked up the call despite the weirdness of the situation. The virtual display materialized above the slate, and she was immediately hit by a face she remembered well. The human ambassador she once saved, Darius. He was a bit older now, perhaps, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and his brown hair was shorter, more military in style. But the eyes were the same, warm and earnest, and impossibly hopeful in a way that felt almost painful to look at. "Darius, is that you?" The words came out before she could stop them, surprise evident in her voice. She hadn't meant to sound so shocked, so uncertain, but there it was. The human waved with a facial configuration that managed to be both formal and awkward, like he wasn't quite sure of the proper greeting conventions anymore. "Hello, Lihila. It's been a long time." His voice was clear, and she could hear something in the background. Voices, equipment noise, the sounds of a working spaceship. She tried to figure out a reason for his call, running through possibilities in her mind. A personal check-in? Unlikely after 5 years of complete silence. An official diplomatic overture? But humanity had cut all ties with the Council after the incident. Maybe he wanted to reminisce. That seemed frivolous given everything else going on. When she failed to come up with anything reasonable, she simply asked, "Are you aware that I'm not an ambassador representing my species anymore? In fact, it's very weird that you have my personal contact information." Darius panicked a bit at her accusation, his hands coming up in a placating gesture that she recognized as a very human expression of innocence. "Oh, I'm not a creep or anything like that, I promise. Your contact was in the old council database, and I thought—" He took a breath, visibly collecting himself. "Look, I know this is strange, but I'm expecting an invitation for a meeting. In a spaceship. I just wanted to talk about our relationship." He paused, his face flushing in a way she remembered as distinctly human. That rush of blood to the skin that betrayed embarrassment. "I mean the relationship between our species, our peoples, the diplomatic relationship." She sighed, running a hand through her too long silver hair and feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over her. She was still seeing that kind of hopeless naivete that almost got him killed when he once awkwardly offered a handshake to the Brizak ambassador. The Brizak had taken offense when a new species dared to try and talk to him as an equal, had viewed the extended hand as an insult worthy of violence. The handshake had been interpreted as mockery. If she hadn't been standing right there, hadn't seen the way the Brizak's acid sacs had begun to swell with the telltale inflation that preceded an attack, Darius would have been melted down to his bones before security could intervene. "Darius, you should ask the current ambassador for a meeting, not me. I have no authority anymore. I can't negotiate treaties or make promises on behalf of my people." She kept her voice gentle, trying to let him down easy. He seemed like he meant well, but whatever he wanted, she couldn't provide it. The human scratched his head, looking almost sheepish. "Well, that's the thing. I've made some deals with some politicians already, and actually a picture with you specifically, is kind of a requirement to proceed with the operation." He added quickly, seeming to realize how strange that sounded. "Which honestly is a small price to pay, since humanity would be taking a lot of risks for what we're about to do." Confusion washed over her like cold water, leaving her feeling disoriented. "Operation? What are you about to do?" Words came out sharper than she'd intended, but this was starting to feel less like a social call and more like something much larger and more complicated. The human smiled, and there was something in that expression that reminded her of the young man who had stepped off his ship 5 years ago, full of hope and wonder and completely unprepared for the reality he was about to face. "You'll have to accept my invitation to find out." His tone was obviously playful, like they were discussing a surprise party, rather than something that required operations and risk and political negotiations. Despite herself, despite everything, the war, the fear, she found herself responding to that warmth. "I accept. As long as you have something to eat that's not those grains my government is offering their people." She didn't even have time to realize that some of her accumulated bitterness had leaked in the way she said it. But Darius didn't seem offended. If anything, his smile grew wider. "You'll have a lot of food at your disposal. We brought the whole cultural exchange team from years ago. They're frustrated they were forced to return to Earth that time after their ambassador, also known as me, had almost been melted alive. They've been dying to share their cuisine with someone who'll appreciate it." He smiled. "Wait for the shuttle in your yard," Darius added, his tone becoming more businesslike. "It'll be there in 20 minutes. Pack light, you'll only need to be away from home for a day at most." She looked at the screen of her data slate in disbelief when the conversation was over, the image dissolving and leaving her alone in her living room once more. What had she just agreed to? Meeting humans in space? On their ship? For some mysterious operation that required her specific presence and apparently had already been negotiated? It was absurd. It was bizarre. It was potentially dangerous. She didn't know what humanity's military capabilities were these days. Didn't know their intentions, didn't know anything except that they'd isolated themselves for 5 years and were suddenly back with mysterious plans. And yet, for the first time in months, she felt something other than resignation. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe just the desperate need for anything that wasn't another day of war and blame, and those terrible grains that tasted like processed cardboard mixed with despair. 20 minutes later, she stood in her front yard as promised, looking up at the cloudy sky. The rain had stopped temporarily, leaving everything wet. The air shimmered, and a shuttle materialized in front of her. It was small, sleek, and decidedly military in design, despite the lack of obvious weapons. "Ambassador Lihila, I'm Lieutenant Johnson. Welcome aboard." The title hit her hard. Ambassador. No one had called her that in 2 years. She climbed aboard without correcting him, and the shuttle lifted off so smoothly she hardly felt the acceleration. Greetings, Dirtlings. While Lihila's making her way up to her rendezvous with the humans, a very quick intermission to say, if you're enjoying this story, please consider hitting that like button. It helps the channel immensely. We greatly appreciate your support. You guys are awesome. Back to the story. 2 hours later, Lihila found herself already in space, somewhere in a cloaked ship. She still couldn't quite believe it. A cloaked ship, the kind she had no idea the humans possessed. The technology required for that was advanced, expensive, and typically restricted to the most developed military forces in the galaxy. And this ship had apparently entered their system without either her species or the Brizak realizing it was there. That alone should have been impossible, given the sensor networks both sides had deployed throughout the system. The shuttle that had picked her up from her yard had been small and nondescript, but the moment she'd stepped inside the larger vessel, she'd known this was military hardware. Everything was clean and practical, just raw functionality, at least most of it. Now she stood in the meeting room, and she was already impressed despite her best efforts to remain skeptical. The room contained 3 humans. Darius was there in a neat suit, charcoal grey with subtle pinstripes, very formal, standing beside a woman also formally dressed in a navy blue outfit. But it was the third human that made her reassess everything. An older male human in military uniform, his chest decorated with medals and insignias that even she could recognize as marking someone of significant rank. The meeting room itself was furnished with a large wooden table, the surface polished to a mirror shine. Real wood, not synthesized material. That was a luxury even during peacetime. But what truly captured her attention was the enormous viewport that dominated one wall. Through it, she could see her planet spinning below, the green of the forests, the blue of the oceans, and the purples of the plains that were unique to her world. From this height, the war seemed distant, almost unreal. The planet looked peaceful, beautiful, unmarred. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Darius said, following her gaze. His voice was soft, almost reverent. "It looks a bit like Earth. From up here, it's even hard to see that a war is happening. I imagine that's one of war's cruelest tricks, that from far enough away, everything looks fine." She tore her eyes away from the viewport to look at each of their faces in turn. The woman appeared to be in her 40s, with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone used to authority. The military officer was older, perhaps 60, with grey hair cropped close to his skull and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades of service. And Darius, still young but no longer quite as naive as he'd been 5 years ago, positioned between the two like a bridge. "What is going on here?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the confusion and apprehension churning in her gut. Darius gestured to his companions. "First, let me introduce you properly. This is General Felix Kowalski. He is basically the only one who is friends with every single admiral in charge of the Terran Fleet. And this is Senator Alyssa Clark, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in our government. This operation would never have been approved without their help, no matter how much I wanted it." She felt something cold settle in her stomach. A general? A senator? This wasn't a social call or a simple diplomatic overture. This was something significant, something that had required the highest levels of government approval and military planning. The general gave her a crisp nod. "Ambassador Lihila, it's an honor to finally meet you. Ambassador Reeves has spoken highly of you over the years." Senator Clark's expression softened fractionally. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. We know this must be confusing." "Confusing doesn't begin to cover it." She looked between the three of them. "What is happening? Why do you have a stealth ship here on my planet? What operation?" Each question came out sharper than the last, her patience finally exhausted. The three humans exchanged a look, the kind of wordless communication that spoke of long discussions and difficult decisions already made. There was something almost choreographed about it, like they'd rehearsed this moment. Finally, Darius took a breath and explained. "Humanity didn't bring just one ship, Lihila. We brought the entire Terran Fleet. All of it. Every warship, carrier, destroyer, and support vessel we've built over the past 5 years." He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. His next words fell into the room like stones into still water. "We're about to get involved in the war to repay the debt of saving me that time 5 years ago, when humanity still didn't know what the galaxy was truly like." She stared at him, at all of them. The words made sense individually, but strung together, they created a sentence that her brain refused to process properly. The entire Terran fleet. As far as she remembered, the humans had just crawled out of their homeworld when Darius had arrived at the Council. Those space babies who got scared and locked themselves home after being received with hostility in the galactic community. They had, maybe 50 ships? 100 at most. Respectable for a species that had just achieved faster-than-light travel, but hardly enough to make a difference in a war against the Brizak, who fielded thousands of warships across dozens of systems. "The entire Terran fleet," she repeated, tasting the words and finding them impossible to swallow. You're saying you want to fight the Brizak, to help us?" She shook her head, trying to organize her thoughts into something coherent. "Darius, I appreciate the sentiment. Truly, it's more than anyone else has offered. But you don't understand what you're suggesting. The Brizak have thousands of ships. They've been crushing our defenses for 2 years straight. They have manufacturing capacity that outstrips ours by orders of magnitude. And humanity, no offense intended, but last I heard, you just barely established colonies on 2 of your neighboring systems. You're still learning how to navigate interstellar space effectively. This isn't a fight you can win. This isn't even a fight you can survive." General Kowalski spoke up for the first time since the introduction. "With respect, Ambassador Lihila, you're working with outdated intelligence. Understandable given the circumstances and your current situation, but incorrect nonetheless." Senator Clark leaned forward, her hands folded on the wooden table in a gesture that somehow managed to be both casual and formal. The incident with Ambassador Reeves 5 years ago was instructive for humanity. It taught us several important lessons about the galaxy we'd just entered. Painful lessons, but necessary ones. "We learned that the universe isn't the peaceful federation we'd hoped for," Darius added, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "That there are species out there who view violence as a first resort rather than a last one. That being new and hopeful and friendly can make you a target rather than earning you friends. That naivete in this galaxy is a death sentence." The general took over, standing and walking to the viewport. "Humanity has always been a bit paranoid, Ambassador. It's a survival trait from our history. We spent most of our existence on a single planet, developing in tribes that compete for resources. We fought countless wars among ourselves before we finally achieved something resembling unity. When we achieved FDL travel, we'd already been watching the stars for centuries, wondering what was out there, hoping for the best but planning for the worst." He paused, looking down at her planet.
The incident with Ambassador Reeves made us realize our worst-case scenarios weren't paranoid enough. We didn't lock ourselves on Earth in fear, Ambassador. We locked ourselves on Earth to build.
Build? Lihila asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer and dreading what it might mean.
Warships,
the general said simply, turning to face her.
Thousands of them. We took every resource we could spare from our colonies, converted every construction facility, recruited every engineer and pilot we could train. We built shipyards in orbit around Mars, around Luna, in the asteroid belt. We designed new classes of vessels based on what we learned from studying Galactic Council technology. We built until we had a fleet big enough to feel safe outside our borders again. Big enough that if someone tried to melt another one of our ambassadors, we could respond with overwhelming force.
Senator Clark's expression softened, and there was genuine warmth in her eyes. But it wasn't just fear driving us, Lihila. It was also you. Me? The word came out strangled, weak. The senator nodded slowly. You showed us that while there is hostility out here in space, there is also kindness, and there are people worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth taking risks for. You didn't have to push Ambassador Reeves out of the way. You could have let the Brizak kill him and avoid making an enemy. But you didn't. She paused, and her voice dropped lower. You showed us there are reasons to fight for others beyond simple self-interest, reason to avoid a path of isolationism and violence. And that compassion is worth preserving, worth defending. Lihila still couldn't fully grasp how profoundly she had impacted humanity by just saving one of them. It seemed impossible that one moment, one choice made in the space of a heartbeat could have reshaped an entire species' approach to the galaxy. Surely there were other factors, other considerations. This had to be more complicated than they were making it sound. But before she could voice her doubts, Darius simply stood from his seat and walked toward her. He stopped a meter away, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes, the conviction that burned there. Very slowly, he pulled up his right sleeve, rolling it back to expose his forearm. There, on his skin, was a scar. It was pale against his naturally tan complexion, about 3 centimeters long and irregular in shape. The edges were rough, marking it as a chemical burn rather than a clean cut. And it matched her own perfectly. She knew without looking that if she placed her arm next to his, the scars would align exactly. 2 pieces of the same wound, created by the same sticky droplets of acid that had caught them both as she pushed him aside from the splash zone. This, Darius said, his voice quiet but firm, is the proof that you saved me once. And now, we're going to save your planet and get revenge at the same time. He smiled, and in that expression she saw not the naive young ambassador, but someone who had grown, who had learned hard lessons about the galaxy, but who had kept his core of basic decency intact. Thank you, Lihila, not as an ambassador, but as the human you saved. Thank you for showing us that heroism exists out here. She felt something crack in her chest. Some wall she'd built around herself over the past 2 years of isolation and blame. These people, these humans who barely knew her, who had every reason to stay safely isolated on their distant world and avoid the galaxy's problems, were here. They built an entire fleet. They traveled across hostile space. They'd risked detection by the Brizak, all because she made one good choice 5 years ago. All because she'd pushed a stranger out of the way of danger. General Kowalski turned away from the viewport and spoke into his comm unit.
All ships, this is Kowalski. Proceed with Operation Debt Payment. I say again, proceed with Operation Debt Payment. Show them what happens when you threaten humanity's friends.
Darius gently took Lihila's arm, her left one, she noticed, and brought her closer to the viewport. You're going to want to see this, he said quietly, his voice almost reverent. You saved one human 5 years ago. Now watch humanity save your world. She looked down at her planet. that beautiful sphere of green and blue and purple spinning against the black of space. For a moment, nothing changed. The planet continued its rotation, clouds drifted across continents, the terminator line between day and night crept steadily westward. Then, space itself seemed to move, like heat rising from hot pavement. First, one ship appeared, dropping its cloak in a ripple of displaced light and distorted stars. Then another, and another. They kept coming, materializing out of nothing like stars igniting in a dark sky. Hundreds of them, no, thousands of spaceships, all decloaking at once in perfect formation. The fleet spread out in formations she had never seen before. Destroyers on the flanks, positioned to intercept threats. Fighters launching in coordinated swarms, spreading out in patrol patterns. Weapons charging, visible as the slight glow of power systems coming online. And as she watched, barely able to breathe, barely able to process what she was seeing, they entered her planet's atmosphere with their guns blazing. She could see the brilliant flashes of weapons fire, could track the paths of missiles as they streaked towards Brizak positions, identified by their targeting systems. Humans weren't testing defenses or probing for weaknesses. They were attacking with overwhelming force, with the kind of coordinated firepower that turned battles into massacres. She spent hours at the viewport, unable to tear herself away from the scene unfolding below. Time became meaningless as she watched the Terran Fleet dismantle 2 years of Brizak occupation in what felt like mere moments. Her optical implant kept feeding her news updates, the streams of information overlaying her vision with data she could barely process. The southern continent secured in minutes. The orbital defense platforms the Brizak had positioned around her planet neutralized and destroyed. The massive Brizak command ship that had been coordinating the occupation from high orbit, the symbol of their dominance, torn apart by concentrated human fire. Every few minutes, the updates became more surreal. Brizak ground forces surrendering en masse. Supply depots destroyed, communication relays obliterated. The professional destruction was almost beautiful. It was the kind of military operation her own forces had dreamed of executing, but never had the strength to attempt. Darius stood beside her occasionally, offering quiet commentary. "Third waves just completed their bombing runs on the western military complex," he'd say, or "fighter squadrons are establishing air superiority over the capital." Senator Clark had excused herself after the first hour, muttering something about coordinating with Lihila's government. General Kowalski remained, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the forces work with the calm satisfaction of a craftsman observing a job well done. Her legs were already betraying her after the 3rd hour, trembling. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the initial shock was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. She wanted to sit, to collapse into one of the chairs around that beautiful wooden table. But she couldn't make herself move away from the viewport. This was her world being saved. How could she look away? Her personal data slate had started vibrating almost immediately after the fleet's appearance, and it hadn't stopped. The buzzing was constant now, a persistent tremor against her hip where she'd clipped it to her belt. When she finally pulled it out to glance at the screen, she found it flooded with messages, hundreds of them. Inquiries about what was happening, demands for information, questions about the unknown fleet that had appeared from nowhere. Reporters wanted interviews, government officials wanted briefings, old colleagues wanted explanations. And buried among the panicked questions and demands were other messages, ones that made her jaw tighten. Officials offering her job back. Politicians who had blamed her for the war, now suddenly remembering her competence. The Prime Minister himself had sent 3 separate messages, each one more obsequious than the last. "Your expertise is needed in this crisis," one read, as if he hadn't been the one to strip her of her position 2 years ago. "We should discuss your immediate reinstatement to the diplomatic corps," Read another, sent just minutes ago when it became clear the Brizak were in full retreat. She ignored it all for now. The messages could wait. The politics could wait. The apologies and the sudden reversal of fortune and the desperate attempts to curry favor with her now that humanity had proven itself a power worth respecting, all of it could wait. Right now, she just wanted to watch her world being freed, to witness this impossible thing that was happening because she'd made one kind choice 5 years ago. By the time the last Brizak ship jumped to FTL, fleeing the system with the Terran Fleet in pursuit, her vision was blurring with tears. She didn't remember starting to cry. Behind her, Darius approached carefully. "We're going to chase them back to their space," he said gently. "Make sure they understand that your world is under human protection now, but they'll take a few days." He paused, and when he spoke again, there was warmth in his voice. "In the meantime, I believe I owe you dinner. One that doesn't get interrupted by acid and violence." She turned to face him. This human, who she'd saved on impulse 5 years ago, whose survival had somehow saved her world in return. What kind of food?" she asked, her voice hoarse from hours of silence and crying. Darius grinned, and the expression was so genuinely pleased that she felt something warm unfold in her chest. "Everything. The cultural exchange team has been cooking for 3 days straight. They're so excited to finally share Earth cuisine with someone that they've prepared dishes from 20 different regions. Fair warning, though, some of it is spicy. Much spicier than Brizak acid." Despite everything, the war, the fear, the years of isolation and blame, the surreal afternoon of watching her planet being liberated by aliens who owed her nothing, she laughed. "After everything that's happened today, I think I can handle some spicy food." As she followed him out of the observation room, she touched her scarred wrist one more time. She'd spent so long thinking of it as a mark of her fall from grace, a reminder of the moment everything went wrong. But maybe she'd been looking at it backward all along. Maybe it wasn't a scar from an ending, but from a beginning. The day she'd saved one human and, without knowing it, given humanity a reason to save her entire world in return. Some debts, she realized, as the smell of unfamiliar spices drifted down the corridor, were worth repaying, and some scars were worth bearing. For the first time in 2 years, Lihila felt something she'd almost forgotten.